In the quiet suburbs of London, a little girl's mind did not break, it adapted. Each time the unimaginable struck her brain, built another voice, another self to bear the pain. By the time she reached adulthood, she was no longer one person. She was 2,500. Her name is Jeni Haynes, and her story is unlike anything psychiatry or law had ever seen. For decades, Jeni lived in silence, carrying thousands of companions within her own mind. But the silence ended when the time came to face the man who had caused it all. In a hushed courtroom, one of her child alters forever, 4 years old, took the stand. For the first time in history, dissociative identity disorder spoke in open court. And justice listened. This is not only a story of survival, but of how thousands of fractured voices became an unbreakable chorus. Before we begin, let us know in the comments when and where you are joining us tonight. Midnight morning or the hours in between. We want to know when these forgotten histories reach you. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the 7th Mark, so you never miss the stories the world tried to silence. In late 1960s, London, a young girl was born into what should have been an ordinary life. Yet her earliest years were marked by experiences so overwhelming, so unspeakable, that her mind could not contain them in a single self. What happened inside her was not collapse, but division. Her consciousness fractured, creating hidden compartments where memories could be locked away and pain carried by others who existed only in her mind, but were no less real. Psychiatrists now call this dissociative identity disorder, once known as multiple personality disorder. It is most often found in survivors of repeated long-term trauma in early childhood. When what should never happen does happen, the mind finds a way by becoming more than one. For Jeni, it began when she was no older than 4. What would later be recognized as dissociation first appeared as blank spaces, sudden lapses in awareness and shifts in demeanor no one could explain. To outsiders, it looked like daydreaming. In reality, her mind was already retreating, building walls, shaping voices, dividing memory. Every dissociative system is unique, sculpted by circumstance. Some survivors develop a handful of alternate selves. Jeni created dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Each carried a fragment of her life, fear, rage, duty, even joy, too dangerous to express in daylight. Each time the threat returned, her mind created another altar to bear the unbearable. This was not weakness, but the opposite, an extraordinary survival strategy. What one identity could not endure, another took on. In this way, Jeni kept moving forward when most would have been stopped forever. Researchers still debate dissociative identity disorder. Is it a mental illness? Or is it, as Jeni's life shows, a creative act of survival? The argument continues, but in her case, the truth is clear. Without division, there would have been no survival. By adolescence, Jeni's inner world had become an entire community. Child alters frozen at the age they were created, protectors who watched and guarded fragments that carried pain, so others could live without it. Her life was no longer a single story, but a chorus of voices, each protecting her, each carrying part of her history. The fractures within Jeni's mind were invisible to the world outside. No outward signs betrayed the private architecture. She was building an intricate design of survival that only she could inhabit. What looked to others like an ordinary child carried within her thousands of silent rooms, each one formed to hold a memory, too dangerous to keep in the open. Decades later, clinicians would confirm what no one in those years could have guessed. She did not create a handful of altars, but thousands. Her case would enter the annals of psychiatry as one of the most extraordinary examples of dissociative identity disorder ever documented. Yet, in the beginning, it all started with just one. Her name was Symphony. Born from necessity, Symphony was Jeni's first alter, a 4-year-old voice created to protect the child when no one else could. She was not an imaginary friend, not a game of make-believe, but a mind within the mind. A fragile sentinel, small and innocent, yet charged with carrying the weight of what Jeni herself could not bear. In cases of dissociative identity disorder, the first alter often emerges at the very moment a child's reality becomes irreconcilable, when the normal rhythms of life clash with unspeakable harm. The psyche splits. The core self continues to function, while the new self absorbs the memories too toxic for survival. For Jeni, Symphony became this vessel. She carried the raw, unfiltered moments of trauma, preserved with the clarity of a child, but separated from Jeni's daily awareness. Clinicians who later examined Jeni's system described Symphony as a protector. Though she remained forever 4 years old, her role was not weakness, but endurance. She did not resist or fight back, she contained. Every memory that might have broken Jeni was instead sealed within Symphony's keeping. This is the paradox of child alters. They are simultaneously the most vulnerable and the most indestructible. Their innocence makes them incorruptible witnesses. Their voices never age, never reinterpret. They remain frozen at the moment of their creation. Symphony did not grow older even as Jeni entered adolescence and then adulthood. She stayed 4 years old, unchanged, waiting. Each time the unbearable returned, Symphony came forward. Jeni would recede, awareness dimmed, memory erased. In this way, Jeni could still go to school, complete her lessons, laugh with classmates while Symphony carried the unbearable silence. It was not a cure, it was survival. And yet, what makes Symphony truly extraordinary is not only what she did in childhood, but what she would do in adulthood. Decades later, when Jeni finally faced her father in court, it was Symphony who stepped forward. The same child alter forever 4 years old spoke aloud in a courtroom. For the first time in legal history, an alter testified as a witness. What Symphony remembered untouched by the passage of years became admissible evidence. Observers in that courtroom later recalled how unsettling the moment was, how undeniable. Symphony's voice carried no hesitation, no uncertainty. She remembered everything because she had never forgotten. Frozen in time, she had preserved the events exactly as they occurred. Where the adult Jeni might have faltered, Symphony spoke with the unwavering clarity of a child who had lived through it. In that instant, survival became justice. What began as a hidden compartment of the psyche became a weapon of truth. Without Symphony, conviction might never have been possible. She was the first and perhaps the most important, but she was not alone. For every memory, Symphony carried others were created to shoulder what even she could not. By the time Jeni reached adolescence, her inner world was no longer defined by one protector. It was crowded, layered alive with dozens, then hundreds of voices. Each emerged with a purpose. Some carried memories, fragments of events too corrosive for the core self. Others specialized in emotions, fear, anger, sorrow containing them so Jeni could function in daily life. Still others were designed for distraction, offering fragments of play or normalcy in a world where ordinary childhood had been stolen. This multiplication of identity was never a choice. It was survival, etched into the very architecture of her mind. The human brain, when exposed to relentless trauma in its most formative years, finds ways to dissociate so profoundly that new personalities are created, each one designed to hold part of the burden. Psychiatry calls it dissociative identity disorder. Rare, yes, but well established in clinical literature as a direct adaptation to inescapable harm. Jeni's case, however, stood apart. Where most documented systems included a handful of alters, sometimes a few dozen in exceptional cases, Jeni's system multiplied by the hundreds before she even reached adulthood. Each trauma demanded a new division. Each new wound was met with a new protector. It was as though her mind had learned a terrible, precise rhythm divide again. Create another, survive one more day. From the outside, Jeni appeared quiet, even ordinary. There were no obvious fractures to the casual observer. The enormity of her inner world remained hidden. It was only in private moments, sudden shifts in voice gaps, in memory, interruptions in time, that the system revealed itself. One alter might step forward to endure a threat, only to vanish when the danger passed, leaving Jeni bewildered and unaware of what had transpired. Another would rise the next day carrying a different role, a different burden. Psychiatrists who later studied her system described it as one of the most intricate ever recorded. Some alters held entire life histories. Others were fragments created for a single moment, then fading into the background. A few remained childlike, frozen forever at the age they were born. Others embodied strength, calm, or wisdom Jeni herself could not access. Together they formed what can only be described as an internal society, a chorus of protectors, each guarding a fragment of survival. What made Jeni's system remarkable was not only its size, but its eerie coordination. Dissociation often brings chaos, but within Jeni, there was a strange, terrible logic. Within Jeni's inner world order slowly began to emerge from the fractures. There were organizers who kept track of time, record keepers who preserved memories, and protectors who stepped forward when danger loomed. It was as though her mind denied every external safeguard, had engineered its own living mechanism, an intricate machine of survival operating at any cost. This network of selves allowed Jeni to move through the milestones of life. She attended school, walked through adolescence, and later into adulthood with the appearance of ordinary function. To the outside world, she survived. To her teachers and neighbors, she was a quiet, withdrawn girl, unusual perhaps, but not alarming. Inside, however, the weight of her life was distributed across hundreds of shoulders that did not exist in the physical sense, but bore the burden all the same, and the divisions never ceased. What numbered in the hundreds during adolescence multiplied further under the pressure of years. By adulthood, Jeni did not have dozens or even hundreds of alters, but thousands. Each one a custodian of a fragment of truth, waiting for the moment it might finally be spoken aloud. In the 1970s and 1980s, the psychiatric landscape was not kind to those like Jeni. Dissociative identity disorder, still often called multiple personality disorder, was the subject of fierce debate. Many clinicians rejected it altogether, dismissing it as suggestion or fantasy. Those who spoke of fractured selves were often met with disbelief, skepticism, even ridicule. For a girl like Jeni, even if she had tried to explain the strange gaps, the sudden changes, the voices inside her mind, she would likely have been silenced. The vocabulary for her reality existed only in scattered case studies, and even there it was disputed. This misunderstanding left Jeni profoundly isolated. Within her family, there was no acknowledgement of her condition. Institutions that might have recognized the signs either did not notice or lacked the framework to interpret them. Memory gaps, unexplained shifts in demeanor, moments of absence, they were brushed off as quirks. Eccentricities, perhaps the symptoms of something minor. The silence around her reinforced the silence within her. Yet even in this isolation, her fractured mind continued to serve its purpose. Altars emerged in sequence, stepping forward as needed. One carried the focus required for schoolwork. Another shouldered the weight of unbearable emotions. Another provided just enough normality for Jeni to navigate casual social exchanges. When one fragment became overwhelmed, another would surface. It was not seamless shifts left her disoriented. Her continuity fractured, but it kept her moving. The price of this survival was invisibility. Few ever suspected the magnitude of what lived inside her. And DID, when overlooked, often masquerades as other conditions. Patients are misdiagnosed with anxiety, depression, even epilepsy. Some are medicated, others dismissed. In Jeni's case, the scale of her system masked the truth. She seemed troubled, but unremarkable. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, an entire society of selves labored to keep her alive. As she entered adulthood, the pattern deepened. Altars multiplied relentlessly. Some appeared only once, born to carry a single unbearable incident before receding into silence. Others became permanent fixtures within her inner community. Despite this growing complexity, Jeni persevered. She built routines, maintained appearances, and lived a life defined by quiet endurance. But the distance between her outer presentation and inner reality widened into a chasm. Psychiatrists of the time argued in journals and conferences over whether DID was real or imagined. For Jeni, there was no question. It was her daily existence. But the lack of recognition meant her suffering remained undocumented, unacknowledged, untreated. The longer dissociation endures without support, the more entrenched it becomes. Altars that might have integrated remained isolated, each developing independently, each memory sealed away. By the time her condition was finally recognized, she was no longer carrying a few dozen identities, but thousands. For decades, her story remained unspoken. Her survival was hidden. But silence cannot erase truth. Every memory stored within her, altars, every voice preserved in childhood innocence remained waiting. And one day, that silence would be broken not privately, but publicly in the language of a courtroom. By the 1990s, Jeni Haynes was no longer the hidden child, but a grown woman. Inside her, the chorus of voices that began with symphony had multiplied beyond measure. Where adolescence had contained hundreds, adulthood carried thousands. Psychiatrists who studied her case would eventually confirm what seemed unthinkable. More than 2,000 distinct altars existed within her system, an internal population. So vast that it placed her among the most extreme cases of dissociative identity disorder ever recorded. But recognition did not come easily. The field of psychiatry itself was divided. Some insisted DID was real, a natural if tragic adaptation to trauma. Others argued it was suggestion, a cultural construct, or a misinterpretation of psychosis. Patients who revealed multiple identities were often doubted, dismissed as fabricating, exaggerating, or seeking attention. Jeni did not seek attention. She lived quietly with no desire for notoriety. But when professionals encountered the sheer scale of her system, disbelief was inevitable. A dozen altars was unusual. A few dozen was extraordinary. To claim thousands seemed impossible. And yet, her presentation could not be ignored. Her altars emerged with distinct voices, mannerisms, even handwriting. Some were children, some were adults, some were fragments of singular emotions: fear, rage, despair. They did not appear only under questioning. They surfaced spontaneously, often unaware of one another's actions. Their memories were isolated and precise. What one recalled, another could not. This mirrored exactly what trauma literature had described. Still, skepticism lingered. Could Jeni's case prove the disorder's validity, or would critics dismiss it as too vast to believe? For Jeni, recognition was bittersweet. She was no longer written off as unstable or delusional. Her life had a name: dissociative identity disorder. Yet, the diagnosis came with stigma. DI remained controversial, often sensationalized in films and television. Instead of validation, Jeni found herself living under a new form of isolation. Her experience reduced to debate, her truth treated as theory. The uniqueness of Jeni's case drew attention, though rarely of the kind she wanted. For most patients, doubt arose if they reported a dozen altars. Jeni was doubted because she reported thousands. The sheer number defied belief. To some, it seemed theatrical, exaggerated, impossible. But medical literature scattered, though it was, contained precedents, systems that multiplied into the thousands under relentless harm. Each altar was not fantasy, but necessity, a carefully sealed chamber where unbearable experience could be stored. In this light, Jeni's condition was not implausible at all. It was a direct reflection of the intensity of her past. Her mind had done what every human brain is wired to do: survive at any cost. Recognition brought her no peace. It did not erase her past, nor fuse the fragments into a whole. It did not grant her freedom from the burden of division. What it did was leave a record of a woman whose mind had divided thousands of times, not for spectacle, not for curiosity, but for survival. That record, fragile yet undeniable, would one day carry greater weight. Because the inevitable question now lingered: if these voices could preserve memory, could they also give testimony? Could a courtroom bound by the rules of law accept what psychiatry itself had not yet agreed upon? Inside Jeni Haynes, the thousands of altars did not drift in chaos. Though born in trauma, they had coalesced into something remarkable, a community with its own strange order. Some emerged, often managing schoolwork conversations or therapy. Others stayed hidden, surfacing only when specific memories were triggered. Together, they became not scattered shards, but an army of protectors, each with a role, each essential to her endurance. In most cases of dissociative identity disorder, altars form in response to overwhelming stress, their appearance described as random or chaotic. But Jeni's system showed something different: organization. There were archivists who recorded what happened, detached and precise. There were carriers of emotions, some holding fear, some holding rage, some holding grief, so that Jeni herself could walk through the world with a borrowed calm. There were protectors who stepped between her and unbearable memory. and there were children frozen in time, still holding the innocence of the little girl who first endured. The result was a living structure of resilience. Instead of scattering into disarray, her mind had divided labor, distributing the unbearable across thousands of compartments. Therapists who worked with her described it not as confusion but as adaptation. A fragile yet astonishing system that allowed continuity when none should have been possible. Some altars acted as leaders, mediating conflicts, guiding others, even deciding who would step forward when Jeni's body entered a room. Others retreated deliberately, giving space to stronger voices who could handle daily life. Some remained dormant for decades, waiting for the exact memory that required their presence. It was not order as the outside world understood it, but within Jeni, it was a functioning network. Outwardly, little of this was visible. To family, neighbors, or colleagues, she appeared quiet, sometimes distant, sometimes inconsistent. They saw sudden shifts in mood or unexplained gaps in memory, but interpreted them as quirks or forgetfulness. They could not see the committees of altars conferring behind the scenes. Only in therapy did glimpses emerge, clinicians documenting the unusual stability of a system so vast, each voice holding its role with a strange fidelity. For decades, Jeni's life depended on this silent arrangement. Every altar, no matter how fleeting, carried some fraction of the weight. Every transition kept her moving through the routines of work, of relationships, of survival. It was a fragile order, but it was enough. At the time, Jeni could not have known what this hidden organization would mean. She could not have predicted that one day her altars would be asked not only to protect her, but to testify for her. For years, they had been her defense against the unthinkable. In time, they would become her witnesses. Far away, Richard Haynes lived without consequence. He had left Australia carrying with him no sign of the crimes he had committed, settling in the United Kingdom, where distance and time seemed to shield him. To the outside world, the past was gone. But the past had not been buried. Within Jeni's divided mind, thousands of altars continued to guard memories of what had taken place. Each detail preserved, each moment sealed away, waiting. Eventually, those memories would no longer remain inside. They would find their way outward into therapy notes, into police files, into the hands of law enforcement. The silence that had protected Jeni for decades would shift into something else. For the first time, the voices inside her would be called to speak, not in secrecy, but in public, in pursuit of justice. The pursuit of Richard Haynes was neither swift nor simple. Historical crimes always carry enormous legal challenges. Evidence fades, witnesses age. Documentation, if it survives at all, is fragmentary. Prosecutors must attempt the impossible, rebuilding a case out of the dust of decades. In Jeni's situation, the challenge was greater still. The key witness was not a neighbor, a teacher, or a passerby. It was a woman whose memories had been distributed across more than 2,000 identities. For many, the idea seemed unworkable. How could a trial rest on testimony that was not unified but dispersed? How could credibility be established when the very survival mechanism that kept Jeni alive had fractured her memory into thousands of voices? To investigators, the answer was simple. The allegations were too grave to dismiss. Multiple counts of rape, indecent assault, crimes carried out against a child repeatedly across her formative years. This was not one event to be contested, but a prolonged campaign of harm. Australian authorities prepared charges, But Richard Haynes was no longer within their reach. He had long since left Australia, settling in the United Kingdom, where the past seemed to have been buried. To bring him back would require international cooperation. Extradition is never automatic. Legal teams on both sides weighed the matter, balancing the difficulties of prosecution against the seriousness of the accusations. In the end, the scale of the charges left no room for hesitation. The process was lengthy but decisive. Richard Haynes was extradited, placed back within the jurisdiction of the country where his daughter lived and where his crimes could no longer be hidden. When he arrived in Australia, the list of charges filed against him was staggering. Rape, indecent assault, offences against a child repeated across years. The documents were clinical, stripped of narrative, but their weight was unmistakable. A reckoning decades overdue had begun. For Jeni, the extradition marked a shift in the balance of power. The man who had defined her childhood through terror was no longer an abstract figure at a distance. He was a defendant awaiting trial, facing the possibility of decades in prison. Yet even now, the prosecution confronted an unprecedented question. How could crimes against a child be proven when that child's mind had fractured into thousands of voices? Could testimony delivered through altars preserved in the architecture of dissociation stand as credible evidence? The stakes were immense. For the legal system, this was not only about one man's crimes, but about the very boundaries of admissible evidence. For psychiatry, it was an unanticipated test of credibility, an opportunity to validate what had long been doubted. And for Jeni, it was a moment of no return. The silence that had protected her for decades was over. The man who once seemed untouchable was in custody. The trial had been set. The only question left was proof. In 2019, an Australian courtroom prepared to hear testimony unlike anything ever presented before. The defendant was Richard Haynes, charged with crimes so severe they had fractured his daughter's mind into thousands of fragments. The prosecution's case rested not only on Jeni Haynes, the adult woman, but on the voices inside her. For the first time in legal history, a judge would be asked to consider testimony not from one witness, but from the first of her alters, a 4-year-old child created half a century earlier who had never grown older. Her name was Symphony. When Jeni Haynes took the stand, her demeanor shifted. What emerged was not the voice of a grown woman, but that of a child, high-pitched, tentative, and unaltered by time. The courtroom fell into stillness. Lawyers, journalists, court staff, all expecting ordinary testimony, watched as an adult body gave way to a child's voice, recounting horrors from the late 1960s as though they had happened only moments before. Symphony spoke without the blur of memory that comes with age. She had not grown up. She had not reinterpreted her past or reshaped her recollections. She spoke as the 4-year-old she had always been, her innocence intact, her memory undisturbed. Observers later described the moment as unsettling, uncanny, an adult form, animated by a child's voice recounting experiences of abuse with a clarity that was both devastating and undeniable. For the court, this was uncharted territory. Judges are accustomed to weighing memory against time, measuring credibility against the erosion of decades. But Symphony's testimony defied that calculus. She remembered because she had never aged. She had been preserved by the very mechanism that had fractured Jeni's mind. Her words were not shaped by hindsight, but by the immediacy of a child still living within the moment of trauma. The prosecution presented symphony not as fantasy, not as invention, but as living evidence of dissociation, a voice preserved by necessity, a child frozen in time. Her testimony was more than a recounting of harm. It was proof of survival offered in the only form survival had made possible. The defense wasted no time in attacking the foundation of the prosecution's case. Could an altar, a fragment of consciousness, be considered a legal witness? Was this not, they argued, imagination given voice? To admit such testimony, they warned, would be to open the courtroom doors to fantasy itself. But the consistency of Symphony's account, reinforced by psychiatric testimony, left little room for dismissal. Psychologists explained that child alters retain memory in its rawest form. Unlike adults, they do not reinterpret events or soften them through the lens of time. They remain frozen at the age they were created, carrying memories forward with a clarity that borders on unbearable. In this sense, Symphony was not an invention. She was an unbroken record, the voice of a child preserved by necessity. Her presence marked a legal first. Never before in Australia, and perhaps nowhere in the world, had an altar taken the witness stand. What might once have been dismissed as delusion was now admitted into the record of a criminal trial. For Jeni, this was both exposure and vindication. The child she had once created to bear the worst of her suffering was no longer silent. She was being heard by the law, not as pathology, but as truth. Those who sat in the courtroom spoke afterward of the profound weight of Symphony's words. Her testimony was not complex. It did not rely on detail or analysis. It was a child's voice speaking simply about what had happened. And that simplicity was devastating. Without the erosion of memory, without the defense mechanisms of adulthood, her words cut directly to the heart of the matter. No cross-examination could unravel them. Symphony's testimony shifted the tone of the trial. What began as skepticism gave way to recognition. The court had crossed a threshold, the possibility that dissociation could not only preserve memory, but testify to it. Yet, Symphony was not alone. She was only the first to step forward. In the weeks that followed, more of Jeni Haynes' altars appeared before the court. Not one or two, but 6 in total. Each carried a fragment of the past sealed within them for decades. Fragments that, when pieced together, formed a coherent account of the crimes. What had once been scattered across thousands of compartments inside her mind was now brought into the open voice by voice. The second altar who emerged spoke with the perspective of an older child. Her tone was sharper, her vocabulary more precise. She described incidents Symphony had been too young to understand, filling gaps that the first testimony could not. Another altar appeared, carrying only raw emotion, fear so intense that it filled the room like a living presence. Her words may have been halting, but the terror was unmistakable. Even this, transcribed into the court record, became part of the pattern. Others followed. One remembered places describing rooms with details that matched historical records. Another recalled sounds, the exact words and threats that had framed the abuse. Each testimony overlapped not in contradiction but in completion, like pieces of a puzzle locking into place. Where one faltered, another continued. No single voice carried the whole story, but together they reconstructed it with unnerving precision. The defense tried to exploit the strangeness of it all. They pressed the question of credibility. Could fragments of identity born in trauma really be trusted? Were these not imaginative inventions? Yet every attempt to discredit the testimony faltered under the weight of consistency. The altars did not contradict one another. They did not drift into fantasy. They repeated the same truths across different voices, preserved in separate compartments, yet converging in one narrative. Psychiatric experts reinforced this point. Dissociation, they explained, does not create memory. It divides it. Each altar carries what it was created to hold, nothing more, nothing less. Jeni's 6 altars together formed a mosaic of memory that no single witness could have carried alone. By the time the 6th voice had been heard, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. The initial unease, the sense of incredulity, had been replaced by a sobering recognition. Observers realized they were not simply hearing testimony. They were witnessing the living architecture of survival. A fractured mind had assembled itself not in confusion but in clarity. For Jeni, this was vindication of the highest order. She no longer stood alone. Each altar that spoke was another survivor, another protector, another witness. Together, they dismantled the silence her father had imposed decades earlier. He could no longer hide behind denial or the passage of time. The voices he had forced into existence had risen against him. In the end, the defense could not silence them. To dismiss one altar would mean dismissing thousands, and the weight of their collective truth was impossible to ignore. A single fractured mind had spoken with precision, not chaos. 6 voices, each carrying a shard of memory, had assembled a record unlike any trial in Australian history. And yet, one question lingered over the proceedings. Could dissociative identity disorder be admitted as credible evidence? Or was the court hearing nothing more than the voice of imagination? What unfolded was not merely the trial of one man. It was the trial of psychiatry itself. The prosecution answered the defense with what mattered most: consistency. 6 altars had spoken. Their voices differed, their perspectives varied, yet their stories aligned with one another and with the known facts. The description of rooms, the threats whispered in the dark, the very cadence of events they matched. There were no contradictions to exploit, no fantasies to unravel under cross-examination. Piece by piece, the testimony formed a seamless account, fragments locking together until the picture could no longer be denied. To strengthen this, the court heard from experts in psychiatry. They explained that in dissociative identity disorder, altars are not fantasies but divisions of consciousness, barriers built in the mind so that each self carries what the others cannot. Far from undermining credibility, this structure preserved accuracy. Symphony, for instance, had spoken with the clarity of a 4-year-old because she had never grown older. Other altars carried precise fragments untouched by reinterpretation. The court was reminded that DID is not chaos, but architecture. Protectors, children, record keepers, fragments of emotion, each with roles, each with boundaries. And Jeni's testimony was not spontaneous invention. It had been documented over years of therapy, examined and confirmed before ever reaching a courtroom. What the jury heard was not improvisation. It was a carefully recorded history delivered through multiple voices. The defense pressed hard on doubt, but the weight of the evidence shifted. 6 altars had testified. Their accounts aligned with one another, with external evidence and with psychiatric explanation. The judge, aware of precedent, faced a decision that stretched beyond this single trial. Could testimony delivered through a dissociative system be admitted as valid in law? In the end, the coherence of Jeni's fractured voices prevailed. What began as a debate over imagination versus memory became, in the official transcripts, an unbroken record of crimes preserved across decades. For the first time, DID testimony entered the legal record not as speculation but as evidence. And yet, one question lingered. Could thousands of divided voices truly deliver justice for one child? The answer would come with the verdict. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its close. Richard Haynes, once hiding abroad, now stood in an Australian courtroom surrounded not by silence, but by the voices of the daughter he had tried to destroy. Denial gave way to acknowledgement. He pleaded guilty to dozens of charges: rape, indecent assault, and repeated violations across the years of Jeni's childhood. The court did not deal in vague impressions, but in numbers, count after count, indictment after indictment. Decades of cruelty measured, recorded, and now punished. The judge weighed the scale of the crimes and the nature of the testimony. Richard Haynes was sentenced to 45 years in prison with a non-parole period of 33. At his age, it was effectively a life sentence. The courtroom, which had heard the voices of a 4-year-old preserved in an adult body, now heard the finality of the law. For Jeni, the words were vindication. The altars within her were no longer dismissed as fantasy. They had been recorded, believed, and recognized as truth. The conviction set precedent. Not one charge, but dozens. Not a symbolic punishment, but decades of imprisonment. Psychiatry, long dismissed at the border of law, had been accepted as a bridge between memory and testimony. Dissociation, long debated in journals, now stood in the legal record as a framework for survival. For those in attendance, the sentence brought closure. For Jeni, it did not. Justice did not dissolve the architecture of survival. Her altars, thousands of them, remained. They had been created to endure, and they continued their work. The court could condemn her father, but it could not undo the walls her mind had built. She left the courtroom not whole, but validated. No longer the child in silence, no longer the adult dismissed, but the survivor who stood with 2,500 voices behind her. The verdict was not an end, but a threshold. Beyond it lay the ongoing reality of living with thousands of selves. Justice had spoken. The man who hurt her would never walk free again. But the deeper work, the daily endurance, the remembering, the surviving, was hers alone to carry forward. When the sentence was read, news spread quickly. Headlines appeared across Australia and abroad. This was not just the downfall of Richard Haynes. It was the story of a daughter whose mind had divided into thousands, and of a court that had chosen finally to listen. Within days, 60 Minutes Australia devoted extensive coverage to Jeni's testimony, speaking with her and with those who had walked beside her through the trial. The broadcast presented symphony, and the other altars not as spectacle but as proof of endurance. Millions of viewers watched as Jeni spoke with striking precision about the way her mind had fractured and how those fractures had preserved the memories on which the trial depended. In one evening, her story moved from the confines of a courtroom into the homes of the public. International media quickly followed. In the United Kingdom, where Richard Haynes had lived for decades, newspapers carried stark headlines: a father convicted after his daughter's thousands of personalities testified against him. In the United States, where dissociative identity disorder had long been debated, the case was framed as a milestone. Commentators noted that DID, so often reduced to a dramatic device or dismissed as a psychiatric controversy, had now been recognized by the law itself. Testimony once thought impossible had been accepted as evidence. Psychiatric experts described the trial as unprecedented. Some called it a turning point in the understanding of trauma. Others emphasized that the significance reached beyond Jeni herself. It mattered for every survivor whose account of long-term harm had been doubted or minimized. The acceptance of DID testimony, they argued, revealed something essential: that the human mind's ability to survive even when divided could be honored both in medicine and in law. Journals published detailed analyses examining how psychiatric evidence had been introduced and why the court had found it persuasive. Public reaction mixed fascination with disbelief. The figure of 2,500 altars captured attention, often overshadowing the complexities of Jeni's daily existence. Many were haunted by the image of Symphony, the 4-year-old altar taking the stand. For some, the idea seemed too strange to grasp. For others, it was a profound lesson in resilience, a glimpse of the brain's ability to preserve a child's voice unaltered by time. Across forums, interviews, and broadcasts, the trial was hailed as one of the most extraordinary intersections of psychiatry and law in modern history. Yet, as the headlines spread, scale threatened to obscure humanity. Jeni became a symbol, a milestone case, a figure for psychiatric textbooks. But outside the spotlight, she lived her life as she always had, carrying thousands of voices within her mind. The altars had not vanished with the conviction. Each remained, each still holding its fragment of memory or emotion. The world had named her Survival Extraordinary. But for Jeni, recognition did not erase the daily reality of dissociation. Morning after morning, she woke not to headlines, but to symphony, to protectors and record keepers, to children who had never grown older. The trial was over, the cameras gone, yet her journey carried on in silence. Long after the verdict faded from newsprint, Jeni continued to live in the structure her mind had built. Dissociative identity disorder for her was not an event confined to court records or medical definitions. It was the framework of her existence. Her system of 2,500 altars remained intact. Some spoke openly in therapy, mapping the architecture of her divided consciousness. Others stayed hidden, surfacing only when memories were triggered. A few emerged briefly and then retreated, leaving her with gaps in continuity and sudden shifts in awareness. Together, they formed the unseen chorus that accompanied her through adulthood, middle age, and beyond. Daily life became a negotiation. Certain altars offered stability, helping her maintain work relationships and ordinary routines. Others acted as guardians, stepping forward in moments of fear. Child altars like Symphony remained frozen in innocence, carrying memories without the distortion of time. The system was not chaos, but a network refined by decades of necessity, shaped to ensure survival. Therapy provided a fragile balance. Clinicians helped her establish communication across identities, creating cooperation rather than conflict. Integration. The merging of altars into a single self was discussed, but full unification was neither simple nor wholly possible. With thousands of altars each holding deep and painful memories, did for Jeni was not temporary. It was lifelong. To live with DD was to live with discontinuity. Hours could vanish. Shifts in voice and perspective could arrive without warning. Yet Jeni adapted. She learned to recognize patterns, to anticipate which alters would emerge under pressure, which would retreat, and which carried fragments of joy or sorrow. Her story, she explained, was not collapse, but adjustment, a constant negotiation that had allowed her to endure. Resilience lay in that endurance. What could have destroyed her instead became the very structure that preserved her life. Each altar carried a burden, preventing any one part from breaking entirely. Though fragmented, her mind safeguarded her memory and ultimately gave her the means to bring her abuser to justice. The system that once isolated her became the instrument of her survival. To outsiders, the presence of Tuathi's 500 voices might seem unbearable. To Jeni, it was proof of strength. What divided her had also preserved her. Each altar stood not as a mark of weakness, but as a testament to her ability to withstand what should have been impossible. The burden was also the shield. In that paradox lay the quiet truth of her life. Survival does not always mean wholeness. Sometimes it means endurance through division. The trial of Richard Haynes had done more than secure a conviction. It had shifted the boundaries of psychiatry and law. What was once dismissed as fantasy had been entered into the legal record as fact. Dead testimony had proven capable of withstanding scrutiny. For decades, dissociative identity disorder had been debated. Critics called it suggestion or dramatic exaggeration of other illnesses. Popular culture caricatured it, depicting patients as dangerous or unpredictable. But Jeni's case forced recognition. This was not theory. It was a legal proceeding in which 6 distinct voices corroborated one another and secured dozens of guilty pleas. No court could dismiss that as invention. The case became precedent. In Australia, it entered the record. Abroad, it reverberated across disciplines. Forensic psychiatry, long hesitant to touch DID, now had an example of admissibility. Legal training began to cite the Haynes trial as a landmark. Lawyers, judges, and clinicians alike saw that dissociation could preserve memory with a clarity beyond ordinary recall. The message was never that every claim of DID must be accepted without question. Instead, it was that such claims could no longer be dismissed out of hand. In the world of psychiatry, the impact was just as profound as it had been in law. Jeni's case offered living proof of what many clinicians had long argued, that DID is not a disorder of imagination but a disorder of memory. It is not fantasy, but survival. A mechanism forged in children subjected to prolonged and inescapable harm. Her alters were no longer theoretical fragments scribbled in textbooks. They had spoken in open court, their words preserved line by line in official transcripts. What had once been mocked as fabrication was now recognized as a living archive of trauma. For survivors across the world, the effect was immense. Many had endured lifetimes of skepticism, told that their realities were impossible, their voices unreliable, their pain imagined. Jeni's testimony cut through those doubts. It demonstrated that fractured memory can hold truth, that survival itself can become a witness. By allowing her alters to speak, she did more than confront her abuser. She opened a door for countless others who had been silenced. She gave visibility to those forced into the shadows, widening the space for recognition, not just in law and psychiatry, but in the public imagination. Her case revealed another urgent need: specialized training. Lawyers could no longer afford to wave away dissociation. Judges could not ignore testimony because it came through fractured voices. Clinicians were pushed to shift their perspective to see DID not only as pathology but as resilience, evidence of how the human brain, under unimaginable pressure, creates extraordinary ways to endure. Step by step, the Haynes trial reshaped the professional approach to trauma psychology. And yet, even amid this progress, a haunting question remained. If Jeni's 2,500 alters could be heard and believed, how many others were still hidden? How many survivors live in silence with fractured minds, dismissed by families, unrecognized by courts, ignored by institutions? For every testimony that made it into the record, countless others remain locked away. Memories carried by voices no one has ever asked to hear. Jeni's legacy then is not only that her father was condemned or that DID was acknowledged. Her achievement lies in proving that memory preserved in fragments can still speak truth. Her case became a milestone, forcing medicine and law alike to face what they had long denied. But it also became a reminder of all that remains unheard. The world now accepts that one mind can divide into thousands in order to survive. The question that endures is simple and yet devastating. How many such minds are still waiting? In the end, the story of Jeni Haynes cannot be defined solely by the crimes inflicted on her, nor by the man who inflicted them. Her story is defined by what she built from the ruins he left behind. She entered childhood as one girl and she survived it as 2,500. Those voices, once secret and hidden, became the evidence the world could not ignore. They were the reason her abuser was brought to justice, the reason psychiatry revised its skepticism, and the reason law itself shifted to create precedent. To call Jeni a victim is to miss the magnitude of her endurance. Victimhood describes only what was done to her. Survival describes what she forged from it. Each altar born within her carried a burden too heavy for the core self to withstand pain, memory terror, or function. For decades, they shielded her from collapse. And when the time came, they became witnesses. Together, they transformed unspeakable harm into undeniable truth. This transformation from hidden child to historic witness defines the true legacy of her case. Jeni did not simply survive. She used the very system her mind created to expose what had been done to her. In court, Symphony spoke. 5 other altars spoke. And through them spoke the voice of every child who had ever been told they could not be believed. At that moment, Jeni was no longer invisible. She became the embodiment of resilience, living proof that survival can exist even in fracture. Her role in both legal and psychiatric history cannot be overstated. She forced the law to admit that dissociation does not erase truth. She compelled psychiatry to accept that DID is not fabrication but survival. And she gave the wider public new language to understand trauma not as weakness but as testimony to the brain's astonishing capacity to endure. The symbolic power of her story lies in its paradox. What divided her also preserved her. The same fractures that once isolated her became the very structure that secured justice. Her mind did not collapse under the weight of evil. It adapted, multiplied, and carried her forward until the world was prepared to listen. Where others saw disorder, she revealed design. Where others doubted, she proved. And yet, Her case leaves us not only with resolution, but with a question. For every voice that rose in that courtroom, how many still remain unheard? For every survivor who carries hidden divisions, how many still live in silence, dismissed by those meant to protect them? Jeni's testimony teaches us that survival often hides in the places we refuse to look, in fractured memory, in unspoken voices, in silence itself. She is remembered not for what was taken from her, but for what she became, the woman who survived herself. She endured what should have ended her story and emerged carrying 2,500 voices that proved it had happened. She transformed those voices from a secret burden into a chorus of truth the world could no longer deny. Her story leaves us with one haunting question. If a mind can create 2,500 voices to survive evil, how many more remain unheard, still waiting for justice? Jeni Haynes was once a child, silenced by fear. Today she is remembered as the woman who turned 2,500 voices into justice. Her mind fractured, but it did not break. What should have destroyed her instead became the very structure that saved her. Her case reshaped psychiatry. It rewrote legal history. And it left us with a question that lingers long after the verdict. If one mind can divide into thousands to survive, how many voices are still waiting in silence to be heard? Thank you for joining me in this account. If you wish to hear more forgotten histories and unsettling truths, subscribe to The Seventh Mark and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And tell us in the comments below what time of day or night you are listening. We want to know where these voices reach.